Welcome to our panel discussion on organizing young humanists. Julia Julstrom Agoyo will be moderating our discussion with Lincoln Dow, Christian Hayden, and Jenny Frischtig. Julia.
Thanks so much, Nicole. As Nicole mentioned, my name is Julia Julstrom Agoyo. I use she, her pronouns, and I live on the unceded territory of the Lenape people, commonly known as Queens, New York. I am the AHA Youth Representative to the UN currently, and the FES, or Future of Ethical Societies, liaison to the AU, or American Ethical Union Board. I'm happy to be here with all of you today. So today our panelists will be providing valuable insight into what it is that humanists under 40 are seeking from local groups. They will explore topics including programs and activities that younger generations can identify with, the barriers younger humanists face in joining humanist groups, and what they need from their local chapters. We hope that the session will help you find out how to better engage and support young humanists to create a strong unified movement that is accessible to all. Now, what do we mean by younger folks? We generally are talking about 18 to 40-year-olds, aka current Gen Y, millennials, and older Gen Z. We also recognize that there are distinguishable differences of people in such a wide age range. For example, people in their 20s versus 30s, and that experiences center perspectives. For example, if the defining moments of your childhood included 9/11 and economic falls, or school shootings, climate change, and the pandemic, these experiences inform our big life decisions and transitions, like going to college, what type of career you choose, or whether or not to start a family. With that background in mind, I would love to get into the heart of our session here today and ask if each panelist could introduce yourself and talk a bit about your experience with humanism. Jenny, can you start us off?
Sure. Thank you, Julia. My name is Jenny Frischtig. And I use she, her pronouns, and I'm currently on the land of the Canarsie and Munsee Lenape people, Central or South Brooklyn today. And I first learned about humanism in college. I went to Scripps College and I took some classes in secular studies with Phil Zuckerman at Pitzer. And I had maybe heard the term humanism, but hadn't really learned about what humanism looks like or is, and even sort of the world of secularism, and looking at that from an academic perspective was very interesting. And I became more intrigued by the idea of secular community building. So I started a Secular Student Alliance chapter at the Claremont Colleges, and my interest and involvement in humanism sort of grew from there. And I'm now on the board of the Secular Student Alliance, and very interested in how we can build strong humanist communities, especially for young people. So excited to be part of that conversation.
Thanks, Jenny. Christian, can you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Julia. My name is Christian Hayden. I am an intern with the Ethical Society of St. Louis. I'm also a member of FES and Future of Ethical Societies. And I have been involved with ethical culture around 10 years now. And the sort of my history with ethical cultures, I was since college on a kind of searching journey. I had sort of dabbled into different religious faiths, traditions, and I had happened upon the Ethical Society after I had done a year of service that was really impactful for me. I was, with City Year, I had done a community service learning program. That was my service, was helping run it with a bunch of other people and volunteer group leaders. And these young people would come on Saturdays and they would try to basically make their communities better. At the same time, they were having new experiences, they were building relationships, and it was beautiful. And so I stepped into the Philadelphia Ethical Society, and I felt like that was a place where that can happen for adults. So I could experience that as an older person, older than them. And I kind of stayed involved. And I think one of the big reasons why I stayed really close to the movement of sort of ethical culture movement was because I had a sort of a symbiotic relationship with the Future of Ethical Societies. So I had sort of this community of young people that Future of Ethical Societies are sort of young adults who are sort of maybe located throughout the US in different ethical societies that kind of meet up and form community uh, a few times a year, a little bit more during the pandemic, strangely enough. And that, and then sort of being in a society where I was like one of the few young people, but then also having the experience of being in a group of young people who sort of share the same ideas, but you know, I got to have both of those experiences, so it kind of kept me closer to ethical culture. It's one of the things I sort of think about and appreciate. So that's how I got here today.
Thank you so much, Christian and Lincoln.
Thanks, everybody. My name is Lincoln Dow, he, him pronouns. I am originally from Houston, Texas, although I spend a lot of my time up in New York City. I'm a student at NYU where I study politics, public policy, and public health. And my role here today, as is relevant, is I am the community organizer of the Jews for a Secular Democracy initiative of the Society for Humanistic Judaism. It is our educational and advocacy initiative focused on the separation of religion and government. As you may infer from my role, I am Jewish. I was born and raised into a Jewish family, but a decidedly secular one. And so growing up and as a student, I've always had sort of my foot in two identities, the Jewish identity as well as the secular one. And I've found that these secular spaces are so important, particularly for people who are estranged from their faiths, perhaps their upbringings, and are looking for a sense of community through a really pivotal and developmental time in their life. In high school, I chaired a local group of the Secular Student Alliance and additionally served on the SSA's board for 2 years, overlapping just barely with Jenny. And now at NYU, I continue to stay involved with Humanistic Judaism and the SHJ and the broader humanist movement. So I'm thrilled to be here with y'all and looking forward to a great conversation.
Thank you, Lincoln, and thank you to all of our panelists. I'm very excited for our discussion today. I wanted to jump into the first question, which is drawing on kind of what I was introducing before. So who are the young people making up this demographic, and how does that impact the kinds of things humanist communities can do to welcome and engage them? And anyone can.
I can start on that one. I think it's always interesting when we're discussing young people in humanism or secularism and how to engage this demographic, because we are a challenge for basically all religious groups as well, which is maybe comforting in some ways, but it might also give us some helpful hints on how we can work with people our age. But I always find it fascinating that there really is this pattern across religious groups and the kind of secular community demographic, where people in their 20s, before they're getting married and having babies, don't usually have much of an interest in being a part of an intentional community, like a religious community, or at least aren't attracted to those communities that already exist in their current, shape. So I think there's a lot of potential, and of course there's a lot of diversity within that demographic, but it's not a problem unique to humanism. That is for sure.
I mean,
Yeah,
I think of my, oh, sorry, Lincoln, did I?
No, by all means, take it.
I kind of think of myself and like where I was, as I'm technically still in this younger group, but my gray hair is betraying me, graying hair. But I, when I was younger and what I was going through about, like, as Julia mentioned, I had, I was in high school when 9/11 happened. I went to college when Hurricane Katrina had just happened. I was coming out of college into an economic downturn. I am, worked multiple years of sort of doing service jobs, but then part-time jobs, being underemployed. And so it actually shocks me, sorry if I gave a long introduction, because it shocks me that now that I think about it, that I did stay with ethical culture. Because there was a lot of headwinds for me to kind of just like just kind of get into something else. A lot of my folks were into Occupy. A lot of my folks, are, into organizing now, and in particular ways. And now I think they're also, some of them are healing from all of the time that they spent in their 20s kind of figuring it out. And so some of them are just kind of like in a sort of extended introversion, wary of coming in society at times. And on top of that, the pandemic, which has also made it, in some ways difficult to come into society. So just think about all of those things that are going on, and those challenges, like Jenny said, that are not just only affecting humanism, but groups who are interested in forming community in general. But I think there's also the same things are true, despite all the things that, like, we are still like any other generation. We need places to grow, and learn, and be fed, to be re-energized. Like, and when I say I can mean literally be fed, but also fed in sort of other ways of our like kind of whole being. And I think some people are looking for, I think I was looking for that maybe a little bit more than the average person at that age. And not saying anything special about me, I just think I just thought about that a lot more. But I think it's the need is still there. And I think people come to that or sort of articulate that differently. So just like keeping that in mind, is that we're sort of different, but also the same, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting to hear about how these communities have helped fill a need for you, because I think that is really an important point, is that you have to identify and fill certain needs, because somebody just identifying as a humanist is not enough to get them involved with one of these communities and keep them coming back, because everybody in this generation and these generations, if we're looking at multiple, is busy. We're all so busy, whether you're a student and you're involved in class and extracurriculars and working, whether you're a recent graduate who's working hard, whether you have family issues that are keeping you busy. Everyone's busy. And that's, of course, not unique to this age cohort, but it certainly seems to be great among our particular demographic. So just because somebody agrees with what your group is doing, just because somebody shares that identity, might not be sufficient for them to make it their top priority. We have a lot going on, but if you can tangibly help people develop and help give them something that they are needing in their life, that's going to be very useful. And hopefully we'll get into what some of that looks like.
Yes, that segues perfectly into my next question, which is what kinds of things might be helpful for humanist groups to keep in mind when thinking about welcoming young people to their community?
I do think it's really, I'm trying to think of saying not what not to do, like not just saying that, but what to do. But I do think about some of the things that offer, particular challenges to people who are already, like, if they step into the door and your concern is getting them back in to keep coming, what are things to keep in mind to avoid? And I think one of the things to avoid is to sort of like front loading. It's like all the things that, like, oh, like you're a young person, that means you can help bring in other young people. Or, a ton of people kind of giving them attention, asking them the same question about, like, how did they find out about this place? Who are you? Are you gonna come back next week? Or, or just like giving responsibility like immediately before people kind of get a chance to like become a part of the community. But I do think there's a sort of importance about an openness to maybe like building awareness of a kind of what's going on in what these young people are doing, and not just like social media, but in terms of like where their hearts and attention at. Are you getting speakers and things that address that? Are we supporting groups that are addressing that? One of the things that ethical societies that have buildings, that one of their advantages is that they're able to offer space to meet to groups that may not want to pay for it, or to groups that don't have the resources for events and stuff like that. So it offers these kind of natural ability for partnerships, but you also have to seek them out. They have to kind of be, the groundwork has to be laid to get people like some kind of connection to it, like kind of like I said, outside of just, we may share some common ideas, but like, you know, what kind of ways is that the relationship strengthened so that people can say, oh, this is a place I can come to for other things.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think Christian's first point about kind of what not to do is an important one, because it's so easy to get very excited about a young person showing up, especially for like an in-person meeting, or I guess, you know, over Zoom now or this past year, and to really bring all of your thoughts to the table right away and share like all these great ideas for engaging young people, starting a young professionals group. Do you have friends you can bring next time? We'd love for you to keep coming. And it's so wonderful to be welcomed. But I think that might, for some people, be more likely to scare them away than to have them come back. And it's hard. Like, we definitely acknowledge this is a challenge, because when you have a group that maybe is older professionals for the most part, or retirees, it is hard to attract young people without having young people there. But I think being open to listening to what a new person, a young person might want to do in the group, or like Christian was saying, kind of bringing other interests into the group and thinking about what other entities we can support as a humanist group to help support young people is a great way to do that. And one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is how we can kind of bridge the secular student alliance world and on-campus groups, high school and college students, with the humanist communities beyond colleges, and what happens when our students graduate. And a lot of our SSA student leaders go on to work, or a good number of them go on to work in humanism or secularism related organizations like AHA, and to seek out other leadership roles. But we really want to spend some time and make an investment in a robust alumni program, because we think that could be a really important way to help kind of bridge the, you know, when our students leave college and they go on to work, they ideally aren't becoming one of the kind of floating 20-somethings that don't have any ties to humanist groups. Instead, we hope to be able to engage them and keep them engaged with, you know, in a meaningful way, which I think could really help tie those two kind of life stages together. So hopefully in the coming years, we can put that together and help kind of create those opportunities for humanist communities to welcome former students.
I think there's a very exciting potential there for the partnership between SSA and groups for alums, and I'm excited to see what happens. I will say, in the immediate short term, you don't need to wait for what SSA comes up with. If you are able to co-sponsor an event with a local SSA chapter, or even if you just are in a college town, you have a lot of students in your town, and you can put together some type of event with a really interesting speaker that's going to draw in students or recent graduates or other young people, do it. Because the point that both Christian and Jenny touched on, that young people are not terribly inclined to join a group where there aren't a lot of other young people, is exactly right. And that's a difficult barrier to overcome, because you need a handful of people at once to become a key segment of your organization. You can't just build one at a time, but it can be done. And if you have a really enticing lure to bring people in and keep them involved, that's the way to do it.
Thank you all. And we're going to shift gears a little bit now to the topics of advocacy, activism, political involvement, all things that I'm very passionate about. How do we elevate these issues, especially the role of religion and government, with young people?
I could start with that one. I think one of the big draws for me to humanism and to secular community building, especially when I was first learning about it, was that it provides a space to do this kind of activism work that is not through a religious group or doesn't have a religious base, where, especially on campus, I remember feeling like a lot of the community service opportunities or the other kind of civic engagement opportunities were through one of the religious entities on campus. And I think the biggest kind of connection with humanism here is that there are so many challenges and so many problems in the world that we see as humanists, and many of them, if not all, have a basis at some point in history in religion or a religious dictatorship of some kind. And I think making that connection can seem very basic, and like, of course, like we know that there's that kind of religious tradition behind a lot of different oppressive policies or what have you, but making that kind of clear connection was really helpful for me to see like how humanism can really inform every aspect of activism and political involvement beyond just separation of church and state.
And the connection in many cases is explicit. When you look at, for example, anti-LGBT legislation, anti-abortion legislation that infringes on reproductive rights, particularly in states around the country, you see that these are not simply inspired by regressive theological views. They're in many cases written and advocated for by what at JFASD we refer to as Christian nationalist groups, organizations that believe that America is fundamentally a Christian nation, that Judeo-Christian values, which by the way do not exist, it's a complete falsehood of a phrase, are the core of our system of government, and that we need to get back to biblical principles in particularly state level laws, and that we do that by infringing the rights of minority communities, LGBTQ people, and anybody who may need an abortion. That's a very explicit link between a harmful use of religion and harmful legislation. And we are uniquely suited as folks who push back on the core of that notion that this is a Christian nation, that we ought to be acting in a specific perverted Christian way to counter those pieces of legislation and those harmful policy ideas. That's not always clear off the cuff. It's something that we need to do a better job of communicating to people who share our views on the legislation, because if we can teach them what the core tenets are and how we can better address them, that's a good way to keep the activist types involved in your groups as well, because our generation has a lot of active people, a lot of advocates, and we're all, again, extremely busy and torn between dozens of organizations that are all doing really important work. We can set ourselves apart by saying, look, here's what these particular religious organizations are doing. We have a very clear differentiating factor from them because we also approach this from a values-based perspective, but our values are different and our implementation of those values leads to very different policy. If you can make that connection, and particularly if you can do it without stepping on the work of other organizations, but by working in partnership with them, you will attract a very good and loyal group of activists who share your values and who will be excited to do work on your issues with you as opposed to with other organizations.
Christian, did you want to say anything on that?
I guess I think this generation is actually really like politically involved. Like they're probably more, than any other generation in terms of just pure numbers. But I think, excuse the bird, I'm sorry. It's excited. But I think it's also interesting because I think there's some there is maybe sometimes a tension between how like the sort of where on the spectrum some young people might fall in terms of that might have humanist humanist orientation or perspective, and where some folks in terms of different ages or different sort of there's sometimes a tension. And I think that actually can be a place that's good and like generative, but I think it has to be handled well. And sometimes I think there's both a kind of maybe a resistance to maybe some of the positions of maybe more progressive or younger folks, or maybe a sort of a not understanding or unwillingness to understand their approaches. And I think that kind of like figuring out how to prepare groups to hear things and hear things that they may not, that may make them feel some type of way, that might be a little bit like, oh, I'm being called this, I'm being asked to use this language, I'm being told that this thing that I'm doing is not right. I think sometimes a big turnoff for young people can be the sort of like the unwillingness to engage those ideas at all, and the reluctance. So I think it's important to figure out how do you develop a kind of a way of I don't want to say engagement or dialogue that where young people will feel welcome, even if folks may not ever agree with them, right? Some people will never come to a certain kind of position, but is that perspective welcomed? Is that kind of space open where people can feel like what they'll say will be heard, and maybe shape some way what is happening, not necessarily be all it is, you know? And so I think that's important. And I think we're full of the cool thing about this community in particular is a lot of educated people. But I think sometimes that can move to a certain kind of like rigidness at times. And so I think figuring out how to organize our community so they can have a sort of demonstrated openness to a certain kind of ideas and perspectives, and the weighing, I think would go a long way to make young people feel welcome.
Thank you all. We only have a few minutes for our last question before we take questions from the audience. So here it is. What has and hasn't worked to engage younger folks? And when have you felt included or excluded from the humanist movement?
I think we started to touch on some of this in our, maybe one of the first questions, but working on being welcoming to a new person, a young person coming to a group without maybe being a little too overexcited, perhaps, is a really important balance to find. And I know that can be challenging, and you also don't want to make a young person feel like they're not welcome by like trying to ignore them a little bit so that they don't, feel smothered. But figuring out maybe how to offer things that would be really helpful for young people. Like I was just kind of trying to think of what religious communities might offer, just having those connections with other people. And in addition to having a sense of community, there are really helpful opportunities that come out of having connections with people who are not just other millennials or Gen Zers or what have you. So things like professional contacts, like things in the working world, it can be really great to have that kind of distant connection at some company that you maybe applied for a job at, and things like that might come up through communicating with young people coming to a humanist group. I think it can be helpful to kind of seek that out in addition to the kind of proactive community building and shared experiences that we can have from being a part of a humanist group.
Maybe if just one other person wanted to touch on that, and then we'll go to the audience.
I can touch on it very briefly and leave time for Christian if he has anything to say as well. It's sort of a double-edged sword because you don't want to overwhelm someone with responsibilities and make them feel too welcome. At the same time, if there is a clear delineation such that the young members of a group don't have any say in how it's run, don't have any pathway to leadership, that's not great either. So you want to welcome people in as valued members without making them feel like they're the center of everything. But then at the same time, give them an opportunity to move into positions of leadership, to take on a more active role in your group if that's something that they express interest in. It's a nuanced line to walk, but it's one that can and needs to be walked.
Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you. All of that discussion was very interesting. And I will say we have several questions. I will say a lot of them are versions of, but how do I get young people to come to my meeting? What can I do to attract them? What kind of things will be the lure? I feel like you've certainly touched on some of that, and I would also like to publicly thank Kevin Bowling of the Secular Student Alliance, who is typing some very good answers to the questions in the Q&A. So attendees, if you're not reading the answers in the Q&A, go do that for some new ideas. But panel, is there anything else you can add along that line before I pull out some other questions?
So I think about, the people that I've met in Philadelphia, in different places in different states, who have come into ethical culture. Whether or not they have stayed, that's a whole nother issue, but how they came in. And some of it is really mundane. You almost never guess. I came in, my first meeting to ethical culture came because I went to see my mentor speak. And my mentor was talking about community gardens. Another time, one of my friends said she wanted to find about ethics. She wanted to learn about ethics. So she's like, oh, the ethical society makes sense, right? It's like, no one can predict, sometimes you can't predict it. And I think to some extent, it's like the visibility of what your group is doing, however that can be spread or encouraged. And then who are they inviting to speak? What communities are those people a part of? Are they representative of the people that you would want to bring into the space that would make sense, like a strategic approach? I know with St. Louis has been very tracking their speakers by gender, race, whether they're like profession, like what, and I think the wider range that you can spread, or maybe targeted. If you're targeting definitely like a sort of, a younger demographic, like you're thinking about what are they thinking about, and you may be having events or speakers that are speaking to those things. I mean, it can be very tough though, because if you're trying to do something where the people who do come, you're not sure they'll be interested in. I mean, sometimes you got to figure out how to navigate that gap. But I think that's a big part. It's just thinking about who's in the space, and also like the aesthetic parts, from music to other things that make an experience. Is that going to lead someone in if they're, walking by or maybe like reading about it and say, oh, like this thing is happening. They have some, cool jazz musician that I heard about on NPR, and then they're also doing this thing about this talk. I mean, I think those things can feed each other,
Yeah, I think Christian's exactly right. Good speakers who are going to draw in new people are a really, really useful recruiting tool. The only thing that I'll add, and this is maybe a little bit more in the weeds than we need to get into, but you've got to promote these events. If you're only sharing your fabulous speaker to the group of people who are already on your listserv or in your meetup group or Facebook group, you're not going to reach any new people. You have to reach out to where the groups that you're interested in connecting with already are, be that college campuses or really on the internet. I mean, you don't need to go anywhere physically and put up flyers. Just make sure that you're promoting appropriately on the internet. And I won't get into more details than that because we really don't have time, but there's plenty of good resources out there on how to do that effectively.
So that sort of leads to another question about modes of communication. Are there ways to communicate with younger humanists that you would recommend? Ways that might not be. So Kevin in the Q&A was saying, for instance, Meetup doesn't work well for younger humanists. Are there things to stay away from, modes of communication that work better beyond, email and?
I mean, these are things that are even younger than me, but Twitch and Signal are seem to be big, or seem to be, and if it fits in. I mean, if it's one more thing to stream something through Twitch that you're already streaming through YouTube, maybe that might be something you might want to think about. I think as far as like Signal, I mean, I'm not even sure how it works. I know that some people prefer to be communicated with that way in terms of, because it's like encrypted. Like, so that's a thing, you know? I'm like a little reluctant because I'm just like, it's just another thing. Was it Justin trying to get us to do Discord? Was it Discord or Signal? But
I think it was Discord.
yeah, and it's just like, you know, there's always going to be something new. I think sometimes it's like what makes sense of what you're trying to do. Like if you're having events and stuff, maybe you want to figure out what can help you share across a wide range. Yeah, but if you're trying to directly communicate to people or maybe be able to reach folks a certain kind of way, maybe it looks like Signal. Yeah.
And I'd say first that I don't know half of the things you just named, Christian. So that's embarrassing to be on this panel and feel so out of touch. But I agree that trying to figure out like what the kids are doing these days is probably helpful in terms of communication. But I think there's also a kind of helpful path to help advertise what you're doing and promote your events, like Lincoln was speaking to, through first checking if there are any local Secular Student Alliance groups, and look at where your local universities are, what are the colleges nearest you, and seeing what other like student life, student activities, opportunities there are, because there may be digital bulletins or listservs that you could add your event to or speaker to, and you can even reach out to those offices directly and say, I'm doing this event, would love to promote it with your students in case there's any interest. And maybe they can put it on their calendar or however they promote their own events. And if there are any other young persons sort of groups nearby, like young professionals groups, there's sometimes networking entities in New York. There's like an abundance of these for every different profession, but even in various rural areas, there are still associations for different professional spheres. And I think that can be a really helpful way to connect, since there's often a young professionals component to that.
So we have, I guess, 2 minutes left. So that's time for one more question, I think. And I hope this isn't too big to have a useful answer in 2 minutes, but some older humanists may not be as familiar as a younger humanist with social justice issues of equity, issues of inclusion, and the language they use around those issues can sometimes be problematic and off-putting for younger humanists who are used to talking about these issues in a very different way. Is there a way to sort of bridge that gap so that that's not creating a barrier to younger humanists coming into groups?
I think the first thing I'd say is just the important thing is to not be anti anything, I guess, except, hate speech or anything negative. But to not be against the new terminology and the new kind of phrasing that you might not be familiar with. It's totally fine to not understand the best way to kind of use those words or to not even know that lingo. But I think what's off-putting is when I'm interacting with another humanist or anyone really, and they're like, oh, I'm just so not into like this woke bogus, like it's just, I'm not worth our time. And it's like, it would be okay if that person doesn't use kind of woke lingo, but it's not okay to have that kind of negative feeling coming at me when I might think that that's a very important thing to do. So I think trying to remain neutral if that's the best we can do, but you can also be totally honest about not knowing how to use those words or not knowing the best labels to use. And I think it means a lot to hear someone say, like, I don't think I am using the right terminology anymore, but I'm not sure what I'm supposed to say. So like, forgive me if I say anything that seems off color, please like point it out. And I'd love to address it. And that can be a really helpful way to also just learn.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I
think that's exactly right.
Sorry, Lincoln, go
Yeah,
ahead.
I was just going to say, I think, no, you're fine. I think Jenny's exactly right. And, the only thing that I'll add on to that is you don't need to be afraid of cancel culture. This seems like it's a refrain a lot. I'm so scared of saying the wrong thing. And so long as you are doing your best, so long as your values are in the right place and you are willing to learn and get better and you care about other people and you want them all to have the same opportunities that you do and you care about the underlying issues, the terminology, all that is of secondary importance to the real issues that we're all sharing the same values and working on the same issues of activism. So don't worry too much about this disconnect between younger people and thinking that you're going to scare them away because you just don't share the same language and the same exact view on issues that they do. Chances are you'll be just fine.
Well, thank you so much. This has been very informative and a very important issue to the humanist community and to our chapters who are constantly trying to find the right ways to reach out. Thank you very much to all our panelists.